Welcome back to Cheating Stories Hub. We appreciate every single one of you for tuning in. Before we dive into today's story, we'd love to know where you're watching from. Share your location in the comments below. Now, let's get into this tale of betrayal, strategy, and ultimate triumph. Chapter 1. Silent Signals. Ethan Hayes stood at the construction site, his strong physique tensed as he observed the team of inspectors examining the wreckage of the crane. The acrid scent of burnt metal lingered in the air, a haunting reminder of the close call they had just endured. His trusted foreman, Miguel Vargas, sat in a flipped bucket nearby, his normally steady hands trembling as he filled out the incident report. "Ethan, I can't get it out of my head," Miguel's voice faltered. If Jake hadn't shouted just in time. He trailed off, his dark eyes filled with lingering dread. Ethan placed a firm hand on Miguel's shoulder. "We'll fix this. We'll make sure nothing like this happens again," he said, his voice heavy with the authority of years of leadership. "Every safety protocol will be reviewed, and we'll make the necessary upgrades. I want you to take the rest of the week off. Paid leave, sirrah. It's not up for debate." Ethan's tone was final. He had spent years building Hayes Construction from the ground up, and the thought of losing even one of his team members to preventable harm was unacceptable. A nervous insurance adjuster approached, clutching a clipboard. "Mr. Hayes, we'll need to discuss liability implications," he began, but Ethan cut him off with a wave of his hand. "I want a full investigation into the crane manufacturer," Ethan said, his eyes narrowing. "This crane was inspected just last month. Either someone falsified the reports, or there's a critical design flaw. Either way, I expect answers." He pulled out his phone and gestured dismissively. "My lawyers will handle the details." Hours blurred into one another as the team took photographs, made statements, and spoke with insurance agents. By the time Ethan made his way home, the sun had long set, and a weight of tension sat on his shoulders. He loosened his tie, trying to shake off the stress as he drove, his mind already racing with plans for the safety overhaul that would start tomorrow. The Hayes family home was nestled in the heart of the historic district, its grand Victorian architecture a testament to the taste and vision of his wife Clara. As he pulled into the driveway, Ethan noticed the perfectly manicured lawn and the freshly painted trim. Everything was in its rightful place, just as Clara liked it. He walked inside to find Clara in the kitchen, preparing dinner. Her platinum blonde hair was immaculately styled, and her makeup was flawless as usual. Despite the late hour, she appeared as composed as ever. "Rough day?" she asked, not looking up from the vegetables she was chopping. "Crane malfunction," Ethan replied, grabbing a bottle of water from the fridge. "We came close to losing 3 men. Clara didn't flinch. "Where are the kids?" "Sophie's at her study group, and Leo is at basketball practice. Theo offered to pick them up on his way back from showing some properties." Ethan's jaw tightened at the mention of Theodore Bennett, Clara's colleague from the real estate firm. Over the past year, Theo had begun to appear at family events with increasing regularity, always dressed in expensive suits and offering that practiced, disarming smile. Ethan couldn't shake the unease that came with his presence. "I could have picked them up," Ethan said, watching Clara's reaction closely. "You were busy with the accident." Clara's knife continued its steady rhythm as she chopped the vegetables. Theo was already in the area. It just made sense. Ethan's thoughts spiraled as he headed upstairs to change out of his dusty construction clothes. The master bedroom was as pristine as ever, and he quickly peeled off his work clothes and headed for the bathroom. As he passed the laundry room, he heard the familiar buzz of a phone. Curious, he followed the sound and found Clara's phone buried beneath a stack of freshly folded towels. He picked it up, noticing the message on the screen. "Everything's arranged. The beach house is perfect for the summer, just like we planned." The message was signed simply. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. 15 years of marriage and 2 children had all been part of a carefully constructed lie. His mind raced as he quickly shoved the phone into his pocket. The phone buzzed again, this time with a photo. Clara and Theo at what appeared to be a medical conference, their heads close together as they smiled for the camera. The timestamp showed it was from 5 years ago. Ethan's hands, which had remained steady during the crane crisis, began to tremble. He slipped the phone into his pocket, his thoughts churning. Dinner that night was tense. Every word, every gesture from Clara seemed calculated. When had the performance begun? Had any of their marriage been real? Theo's name came up when Clara mentioned a new development project in the Pearl District. Theo thinks Hayes Construction should bid on it, she said, refilling her wine glass. Interesting, Ethan replied, keeping his tone neutral. He discusses my business with you before bringing it to me? Clara's mask flickered for a moment, a flash of anxiety crossing her face before it was quickly replaced with a practiced smile. He just knows how much the company means to you. Ethan nodded, though a storm was brewing inside him. The pieces were falling into place, but he needed more evidence. He needed to act carefully, strategically. As the night wore on, Ethan lay awake, listening to Clara's steady breathing beside him. The phone he had found felt like it was burning a hole in his desk drawer, where he'd hidden it after dinner. Tomorrow, he would start building his case. He would gather his evidence. His suspicions about Clara and Theo went beyond a simple affair. This was a carefully orchestrated conspiracy. The next morning, Ethan left for work earlier than usual, but instead of heading to the construction site, he parked a block away from his daughter Sophie's high school. Something about her recent behavior had been bothering him. The new interest in designer clothes, her vague answers about study groups, and the way she'd started calling Theo Uncle Theo. His patience was rewarded when he saw Sophie slip out of the side entrance 20 minutes after classes had started. She walked quickly, checking over her shoulder before heading toward the mall. Ethan followed at a distance, his contractor's truck blending into the morning traffic. As he followed Sophie, his thoughts raced. Was this the final piece of the puzzle? Had Theo already started his manipulation with Sophie? Chapter 2. The Web Unravels. Ethan sat in his truck, parked a few blocks away from Sophie's school. His heart raced as he watched her slip out of the side entrance, looking both ways before she walked briskly toward the mall. The suddenness of it all felt wrong. Sophie had always been an obedient daughter, and this behavior was completely out of character. She was supposed to be studying, not sneaking off to meet someone. He started the engine and pulled out, keeping a safe distance behind her. His mind was racing, every possible scenario running through his head. Was Sophie in trouble? Was she aware of what Theo had been doing, or was she being manipulated without even realizing it? Ethan's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he turned onto the main road. As Sophie entered the mall, Ethan parked his truck a block away and started walking toward the entrance. He needed to be discreet. If she caught on that he was following her, it would only make matters worse. He had to know what was really going on, and to do that, he needed to keep his distance. Just as he reached the mall, a familiar voice called out behind him. "Little early for a shopping trip, isn't it, Ethan?" He turned to see Rachel Winters, a familiar face from high school who had become a veteran police officer. Her piercing gaze always had a way of making people feel like she could see right through them. Rachel had an uncanny ability to read people, and if there was anyone who could help him figure out what was going on, it was her. "Just checking on some supplies," Ethan replied, keeping his voice casual, though his heart was hammering in his chest. Rachel raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "You sure? I've seen Sophie here quite a bit lately, always with an older man. Dark hair, expensive suit. She calls him Uncle Theo." Her expression was serious now, and Ethan's blood ran cold. Could this be happening right under his nose? How often, he asked, his voice steady, though the storm inside him was growing. "At least once a week for the past month," Rachel replied, her eyes scanning the crowd. "And there's something off about the way he looks at her. I don't like it." Ethan's thoughts swirled. "I need you to find out everything you can about him, Theo Bennett. Give me a full report." Rachel hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I'll get on it. But Ethan, be careful. Men like him, they usually have powerful friends." She gave him a stern look before walking away. Ethan watched her disappear into the crowd, his mind racing. His worst fears were coming true. Theo was getting closer to Sophie, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized how long this had been happening. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but there were still too many unanswered questions. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Dante. "Dante," Ethan answered, his voice tight. "Mr. Hayes, Dante's voice crackled with urgency. My wife, Amanda, she works at Portland General. She says she needs to talk to you. It's about Dr. Bennett. She's really shaken up. Ethan's stomach dropped. He had a feeling that the web of lies was about to get even more tangled. Tell Amanda to meet me at Joe's Diner in 20 minutes, he said, trying to steady his breathing. And Dante, don't mention this to anyone. The diner was nearly empty when Ethan arrived, the low hum of conversation and clinking of dishes filling the air. Amanda Martinez sat in a corner booth, her nurse's scrubs rumpled from a long shift. Her hands were clasped around a coffee cup, her knuckles white with tension. She looked up as Ethan slid into the seat across from her, her expression filled with uncertainty. Thank you for coming, Mr. Hayes, Amanda said, her voice shaky. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you this for weeks. Tell me what? Ethan prompted, his gaze never leaving her face. Amanda took a deep breath before leaning in, lowering her voice. I used to work at the fertility clinic with Dr. Bennett. He wasn't just careless with safety protocols. There were irregularities. Missing records, late-night appointments that never made it into the system. Her voice trailed off, and Ethan could see the weight of her words in her eyes. She stopped suddenly, her face going pale as the door to the diner swung open. Ethan turned to see Theodore Bennett standing in the doorway, dressed in a sharp suit, his eyes scanning the room. His gaze locked on the booth where Ethan and Amanda were sitting, and Amanda's face drained of color. I should go, Amanda stammered, grabbing her purse. I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes, I can't do this. Ethan watched as Amanda hurried past Theodore, who offered a pleasant smile but made no move to follow her. Instead, he slid into the seat Amanda had vacated, his presence immediately filling the booth. What a coincidence, Theo said smoothly, his smile never faltering. I was just thinking about calling you. That Pearl District project. Save it, Ethan interrupted, his voice cold and firm. He wasn't in the mood for games. Why are you meeting my daughter at the mall? Theo's smile remained in place, though there was a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Sophie mentioned wanting to look at colleges. As someone who serves on several alumni boards, I thought I could offer some guidance. Clara agreed it was a good idea. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Stay away from my daughter, Theo. Theo leaned forward, his tone turning more confidential. I understand you're protective, Ethan, but Sophie is growing up. She needs positive role models in her life, people who can open doors for her future. Ethan's jaw clenched, his body rigid with fury. The only door you're opening, he said, his voice low and dangerous, is one that will lead to destruction if you go near my family again. Theo's smile slipped, revealing a colder, more calculating side. Careful, Ethan. Some doors, once open, can never be closed again. He stood smoothly, adjusting his tie. Give my best to Clara. We have a property viewing scheduled for tomorrow. Ethan watched him walk away, every muscle in his body screaming to confront him, to destroy him right then and there. But he forced himself to sit back down, to think strategically. Theo had made one mistake. He underestimated Ethan. And now it was time to take the fight to him. Chapter 3, Blood Ties. 3 days had passed since the crane accident, and Ethan's mind was still reeling from everything that had come to light. Each new discovery about Theo's manipulation made him feel like the ground beneath his feet was shifting, like everything he had built was being slowly dismantled. But today was different. Today, he was determined to take action. Ethan walked through the busy Portland General Hospital cafeteria, his eyes scanning the room for his injured worker, James Cooper. He had been severely hurt in the crane accident, and today they were reviewing the compensation package Hayes Construction would offer him. Ethan's company took care of its own, and James had been part of the team for years. Mr. Hayes, James said, spotting him at the table and standing up to shake his hand. I really appreciate everything you're doing. I can't tell you how much this means. Ethan smiled, but it was more out of habit than real emotion. You focus on healing, James. I'll handle everything on this end. Your job will be waiting for you when you're ready. James hesitated. Mr. Hayes, this is too much, he said, looking at the paperwork in front of him. The accident wasn't your fault. It was an unfortunate event. Ethan's tone hardened. No, James. It's my responsibility. You're part of my team, and I will make sure you're taken care of. The conversation was interrupted as Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen and saw a text from Rachel Winters. I've got something. Meet me at Joe's Diner in 30 minutes. Urgent. Ethan's stomach twisted. He had a sinking feeling that whatever Rachel had found would only add to the mountain of evidence he was building. Take these papers home, review them with your wife, and let me know if you need anything, Ethan said, standing up and patting James on the shoulder. Thanks again, Mr. Hayes, James replied, his gratitude evident in his voice. Ethan left the hospital and made his way to the diner, his mind preoccupied with Rachel's message. As he entered Joe's Diner, he saw Rachel sitting in a booth near the back. Her expression was serious, and the usual ease between them was gone. She gestured for him to sit down, and without waiting for him to say anything, she slid a folder across the table. I found something big, Ethan, Rachel said, her voice low. And it's not just about Theo. It's bigger than that. Ethan opened the folder and found a series of surveillance photos, medical records, and documents detailing a pattern of behavior that spanned several years. What is this? Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. These are the records of several families, Rachel explained, her eyes narrowing as she spoke. I've been following the trail for months. There are 3 other families in Portland who are connected to Theo. All of them had IVF treatments at the same clinic you and Clara used. And all of them are now separated or destroyed because of Theo's interference. Ethan's pulse quickened as he looked at the documents. How did you find this? Why didn't you come to me sooner? I've been digging for a while, Rachel said, her expression hardening. But Theo's people are good. He's been covering his tracks, and I couldn't get any solid evidence until now. But I've got a list of names, addresses, and phone numbers for the families involved. These people were all manipulated, just like you were, Ethan. Ethan sat back in the booth, his thoughts racing. Every word Rachel spoke felt like a punch to the gut, confirming his worst fears. Theo had been systematically tearing apart families, using his position at the fertility clinic to plant his genetic material and destroy lives. But now it was clear that his operation wasn't just about wealth and power, it was about control. I need more, Ethan said, his voice tight with determination. I need to know everything about Theo's past, his methods. I want to know how far this goes. If I want to take him down, I need to be sure we have everything. Rachel nodded, her face grim. I'll do what I can, but you need to be careful. Theo's a dangerous man. He's got connections everywhere, and he won't hesitate to fight back. I'm not afraid of him, Ethan replied, his eyes cold with resolve. But I need your help. I want to take this to the next level. I need you to give me access to the fertility clinic's records, any documentation that links Theo to these families. I need proof that he's been doing this for years. Rachel hesitated for a moment before nodding. I'll see what I can do. But Ethan, be prepared. This isn't just about Theo anymore. It's about exposing everything he's done. And that includes Clara. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. What do you mean? Clara's involvement goes deeper than you think, Rachel said quietly, her voice low. I found evidence that she was helping him identify the families. She might not have been physically involved, but she knew what was going on. Ethan's stomach twisted with a mixture of anger and betrayal. She knew? She was helping him destroy lives? After everything we've been through, how could she? Focus, Ethan, Rachel interrupted gently. We can't let emotions cloud our judgment. We need to build our case, and we need to do it carefully. We need solid proof before we make a move. Ethan's mind raced as he absorbed Rachel's words. He had suspected for a long time that Clara was hiding something, but hearing it from Rachel made it real. His wife, the woman he trusted most in the world, had been complicit in Theo's schemes. There was almost too much to process. I'll be in touch, Rachel said, standing up. Get ready, Ethan. This is just the beginning. Ethan sat alone in the booth, the weight of everything crashing down on him. The betrayal felt like a storm, tearing through his life and leaving destruction in its wake. But one thing was certain, he wasn't going to let Theo and Clara get away with this. Not now, not ever. Chapter 4. Unraveling the Truth. Ethan sat in his office late into the evening, his mind spinning as he reviewed the pile of evidence Rachel had provided. The walls of his office were lined with blueprints and construction plans, but tonight, they felt like nothing more than a backdrop to his inner turmoil. Every document he sifted through, every photograph, only made the situation worse. Theo Bennett had not only destroyed the lives of countless families, but he had also managed to worm his way into the very core of Ethan's own life. His family, his trust, his sense of security, everything had been a lie. Clara's involvement was the hardest to stomach. The idea that the woman he had loved and trusted for over a decade had knowingly aided Theo in his cruel manipulation of innocent families felt like a betrayal so deep, it cut through him like a sharp blade. But the evidence didn't lie. Rachel had dug up enough to prove that Clara had been complicit in Theo's schemes from the beginning, acting as a willing participant in the web of deceit. Ethan's phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from his brother, Michael. "I've got more. Meet me at the office." The urgency in the message sent a chill down Ethan's spine. He grabbed his coat, locked the office door behind him, and headed for Michael's office. Michael was the one person he could always count on to help him dig deeper into the dark corners of their shared history, especially now, when every step forward felt like it was pushing him closer to the edge. When Ethan arrived at Michael's office, his brother was already waiting, surrounded by a mess of papers and files. Michael's face was grim, his brow furrowed as he sifted through yet another stack of documents. "I've been pulling everything I can find on Theo's real estate dealings," Michael said without looking up. "It's worse than we thought. He's been using these properties as fronts for money laundering. But I found something even bigger, something that connects Theo's entire operation to international fraud." Ethan took a seat across from his brother, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. "What did you find?" Michael slid a series of financial documents across the table, each one marked with red flags. "Theo's empire isn't just built on manipulated IVF treatments," Michael said. "He's been funneling money through offshore accounts, laundering millions of dollars from his real estate deals. And it all ties back to the fertility clinics. He's been making money off the backs of families, but it doesn't stop there." Ethan's stomach churned. "Are you telling me that he's been using the IVF scams to fund criminal operations? What kind of operation are we talking about?" Michael leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. "I'm not sure yet, but I've traced some of the money to foreign accounts linked to a series of shell companies. We're talking about an international network of fraud. Theo's not just a fertility doctor turned real estate mogul. He's a key player in a much larger scheme. This is bigger than us, Ethan." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. Everything was starting to fall into place, but the pieces didn't fit neatly together. He needed to know more. He needed to understand the full extent of Theo's empire and how deep the corruption went. "What do we do now?" Ethan asked, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Michael pushed a folder toward him. "I've compiled everything I could find on the shell companies, the real estate deals, and the offshore accounts. You'll need to take this to the authorities, but be careful. The deeper we dig, the more dangerous this becomes." Ethan nodded, the weight of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. It wasn't just about protecting his family anymore. Theo had built an empire of lies and deceit, and it stretched across the globe. Taking him down would require more than just a legal battle. It would require an all-out war. As Ethan gathered the files, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Rachel. "I've got something on Clara. You need to see it. Meet me at the diner in 30. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The idea that Rachel could have more evidence against his wife sent a wave of nausea through him. He had already known Clara was involved, but he hadn't been ready for more. As he drove to meet Rachel, his mind replayed the events of the past few days. Theo's manipulation, Clara's betrayal, the children's involvement. It felt like everything in his life was slowly falling apart. When he arrived at Joe's diner, Rachel was already there, sitting at their usual booth. She didn't greet him with her usual smile, and her eyes were hard as she slid a folder across the table. "I've been digging into Clara's finances," she said quietly. "She's been helping Theo in more ways than you can imagine." Ethan opened the folder and found a series of bank statements, real estate transactions, and correspondence that linked Clara directly to Theo's operation. "I'm sorry, Ethan," Rachel said, her voice filled with sympathy. "But she's been funneling money into Theo's accounts. She's been part of this from the beginning. Theo didn't just manipulate her, he made sure she had a stake in his operation. They've been working together to cover up the fraud, and she's been using her real estate connections to help him target families." Ethan's hand shook as he sifted through the papers. The evidence was irrefutable. Clara had been in on it all along, using her connections to Theo's advantage while pretending to be the perfect wife, the perfect mother. "How long has she been doing this?" Ethan asked, his voice low. "Since the beginning," Rachel replied. "Before Sophie and Leo were even born, Clara was already in Theo's pocket. The IVF treatments were just the start. He needed her help to hide the real reason he was doing it, to build a fortune off the destruction of families." Ethan's mind reeled as he processed the information. His wife, the woman he had trusted more than anyone, had been part of a global scam. But this wasn't just about money or power anymore. It was about his children, Sophie and Leo. They had been caught in the crossfire of a scheme that was designed to tear apart families. "Where do we go from here?" Ethan asked, his voice steely with determination. Rachel glanced around the diner before answering. "We take it to the authorities. The evidence we've gathered is enough to take Theo down. But we also need to expose Clara's role. She's been just as complicit as he has." Ethan stood up, his resolve hardening. "Let's do it. Let's bring them both down." As he left the diner, his thoughts were clouded with a mixture of anger, betrayal, and determination. He had built his company from the ground up, and now he was prepared to tear down everything that had been built on lies. The war was just beginning, and he wouldn't rest until Theo and Clara paid for everything they had done. Chapter 5: The Reckoning. The days following the meeting with Rachel and Michael felt like a blur of tense anticipation for Ethan. Each hour that passed seemed to stretch longer, the weight of everything that had been uncovered pressing down on him. His mind was constantly occupied with thoughts of how to proceed. He knew the evidence was mounting, and yet the fear of how it would all unfold gnawed at him. He had taken the necessary steps to protect his children, Sophie and Leo. They had been through so much already, their world turned upside down by the realization that their biological father wasn't the man they had always known. Now it was his job to ensure that Theo Bennett and his complicit wife Clara would never be able to hurt them again. Ethan stood at his office window late one night, staring out over the Portland skyline. The city stretched out beneath him, a sprawling network of homes and businesses that represented the empire he had built. But today, the city looked different, hollow, as if the very foundation of his world had been cracked open. The images of Theo and Clara, their lies slowly being exposed, were like a persistent ache in his chest. The phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him from his thoughts. He pulled it out and saw it was a message from Michael. "We've got a break in the case. Meet me at the office now." Ethan's pulse quickened as he grabbed his coat and rushed out of his office. He had a sinking feeling that things were about to escalate, and he wasn't sure he was ready. But the thought of Theo and Clara getting away with everything for much longer was unbearable. When he arrived at Michael's office, his brother was waiting for him, his face pale and grim. "What is it?" Ethan asked, his voice taut with urgency. Michael pushed a folder across the table toward him. "This is it. The final piece." Ethan opened the folder and found an assortment of documents that made his stomach twist. They were copies of the most recent financial records, showing transactions that linked Clara and Theo to several high-level criminals. "These are the real deal," Michael continued, his voice low. "Theo's empire isn't just built on IVF fraud. He's been running illegal property deals, money laundering operations, and blackmail schemes, all with Clara's help." Ethan scanned the pages, his mind racing. He could see the connection to the fertility clinic, the properties that had been purchased under false pretenses, and the families that had been manipulated. But there was more. Clara's name was repeatedly mentioned in several communications with powerful figures from all over the world, figures who had used Theo's business network to further their own criminal activities. "This is bigger than I thought," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They've been working together for years. But now I have the proof." Michael nodded. "This is it. We can bring them both down, Theo, Clara, and the entire operation. The authorities will take it from here, but we need to move fast before they can cover their tracks." Ethan felt a surge of determination flood through him. This wasn't just about taking down a man who had manipulated his family. This was about destroying an entire criminal network that had destroyed countless lives. What's the next step? First, we need to ensure that Clara can't leave. She's planning to make a run for it with the kids. I've already contacted Carmen, and she's getting a restraining order in place, Michael said. Once that's done, we can approach the authorities and let them take over. Ethan's jaw clenched as he thought about Clara, his wife, the woman he had shared everything with. He had loved her, built a life with her, and now he had to expose her for the criminal she was. But he couldn't let his emotions cloud his judgment. This was bigger than just him. It was about making sure his children were safe and that Theo and Clara could never do this to anyone else again. Ethan stood up, his voice cold with resolve. Let's do it. We move now. The next morning, Ethan met with Carmen Rodriguez, the prosecutor who had been instrumental in bringing together the legal framework for the case. She had been working tirelessly to build a case against Theo and Clara, but now everything was coming to a head. Everything's in place, Carmen said, her voice steady as she reviewed the paperwork. The restraining orders are filed, and the authorities are on high alert. They're ready to move in as soon as we give the go-ahead. Ethan nodded, his eyes hard. I want Clara arrested. I want her to face the consequences of her actions. No more running. No more hiding. Carmen gave him a brief, sympathetic look before nodding. I understand. But remember, Ethan, she's not just your wife anymore. She's part of this operation, and she'll be treated like any other criminal involved in a conspiracy. Ethan felt the weight of her words, but there was no time for doubt. Theo and Clara had created this nightmare, and now it was his turn to tear it all down. Later that day, the authorities moved in. Clara's arrest was swift, and her reaction was one of shock and disbelief. She had been playing the game for so long, thinking she could outsmart everyone around her. But now it was over. Ethan stood in the hallway of their home, his children by his side. They were both confused, frightened by the presence of the police officers and the sudden upheaval in their lives. Daddy, Sophie asked, her voice trembling, why is Mom being taken away? Ethan knelt down to her level, his heart breaking at the fear in her eyes. I know this is hard, sweetheart, he said, his voice soft. But sometimes people make bad choices. And when that happens, they have to face the consequences. Sophie nodded, but there was a sadness in her eyes that cut through him. Is it over now? Will everything go back to normal? Ethan sighed, his heart heavy with the weight of the truth. No, honey, it won't go back to normal. But we'll make it through. We'll rebuild together. As Clara was escorted out of the house, Ethan felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. He had won. The people who had torn his family apart were finally being held accountable. But the scars would remain, on his heart and on his children's hearts. That evening, as they sat together in their living room, Sophie spoke up again, her voice small but steady. Dad, what happens now? Ethan smiled at his daughter, his heart swelling with pride. Now we start over. We rebuild our lives. Together. The next few months were a blur of court dates, legal battles, and long hours of therapy for his children. The truth had come out, and while it was painful, it was also freeing. Ethan had never felt more determined to protect his family. As for Theo and Clara, their world crumbled. Theo was arrested and charged with a host of crimes, from financial fraud to child endangerment. Clara's role in the conspiracy was exposed, and though she cooperated with the authorities in hopes of reducing her sentence, her fate was sealed. Ethan had lost his wife, the woman he thought he knew, but he had gained something even more important, the knowledge that he could protect his family. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but he would face it head-on, determined to rebuild what had been broken and make sure nothing could tear them apart again. Chapter 6. A Shattered Foundation. The aftermath of Clara's arrest was nothing short of a whirlwind. The media frenzy surrounding the case was relentless, and Ethan found himself constantly surrounded by reporters, cameras, and legal representatives. Every time he thought he could escape into the quiet safety of his home, another headline would pull him back into the chaos. The story was too big to ignore, too scandalous for the public to let go of. Sophie and Leo were struggling to comprehend the full scope of the betrayal. Their once idyllic world had been torn apart by the revelations, and they were left to navigate a new, unfamiliar reality. The therapy sessions, once a hopeful step toward healing, were now a necessary lifeline. But no matter how hard they tried to process the events, the damage was already done. Their world, once secure in its lies, had crumbled, leaving only the fragments of what used to be. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Ethan sat in his office, his hands resting on the stack of documents in front of him. The legal battle against Theo and Clara was far from over, and there was still so much to be done. But tonight, the weight of it all felt heavier than ever. He had built an empire, a family, only to watch it all be torn down in a matter of weeks. And now, as he sifted through the papers, he was left with one pressing question. What would become of the life he had worked so hard to create? His phone buzzed, breaking the silence of the room. It was a message from Carmen Rodriguez, the prosecutor who had been working tirelessly on the case. "We found something. Meet me at the office." Ethan's stomach tightened. He didn't know what else could possibly be uncovered, but he knew it wasn't going to be easy. He grabbed his jacket, left the house without a word to anyone, and headed straight for Carmen's office. When he arrived, Carmen was already waiting, her expression grim. She didn't waste any time. "We've uncovered more about Theo's connections," she said, sliding a thick file across the table. These documents contain detailed records of his international dealings, including the people who have been helping him launder money. But there's more. We found evidence of a wider conspiracy. Theo and Clara aren't the only ones involved. There are several high-profile individuals connected to this fraud, and they've been using Theo's business empire as a front. Ethan's heart pounded as he flipped through the pages, each one more damning than the last. The breadth of Theo's network stretched far beyond anything Ethan had anticipated. It wasn't just about real estate and fertility fraud. It was about global manipulation and corruption, reaching into industries and governments. The people involved had power, and they would stop at nothing to protect themselves. "We have to expose all of this, Carmen," Ethan said, his voice steely. "Theo needs to be taken down, but so do all these people who've been using him as a pawn." Carmen nodded. "I agree. But this is bigger than us now, Ethan. These individuals have resources, and they won't hesitate to fight back. We're going to need every ally we can get." Ethan's mind raced. There was no turning back now. He had already lost so much, but he wasn't going to stop until every single person responsible for this was brought to justice. The following weeks were a blur of court hearings, legal wrangling, and covert meetings with key players in the case. The scale of Theo's operation was mind-boggling, but it was also clear that Ethan's pursuit of justice wasn't just about retribution. It was about making sure his children, and the families affected by the fraud, had a future free from the shadows of these criminals. It wasn't just Theo anymore. It was a fight against a deeply embedded network of corruption, one that reached into every corner of society. But Ethan was prepared to fight for the truth, to tear down the foundations of this empire of lies and replace it with something stronger. One evening, as the case continued to unfold, Ethan sat down with Sophie and Leo. He had been dreading this moment, but it was time for the truth to be spoken. They needed to understand what was happening and why. "Sophie, Leo," Ethan began, his voice quiet but steady. "I know that things have been difficult, and I know you're both struggling with everything that's happened. But I need you to understand something. We are going to get through this. I will make sure of it." Sophie, her eyes red from days of therapy, looked up at him. "Dad, what's going to happen now? Are we going to be okay?" Ethan took a deep breath. "I want to make sure we're okay. We have a long road ahead of us, but we will rebuild. We will get through this together. You both deserve to know the truth, and I will make sure that no one can ever hurt us again." Leo nodded, his face solemn. "We just want things to go back to normal." Ethan's heart broke at his son's words. "I know, Leo. I know. But sometimes life doesn't go back to the way it was. Sometimes we have to build a new normal. And that's what we're going to do." The following day, as Ethan was leaving for another court session, he received a call from Rachel Winters. "Ethan," she said, her voice urgent, "we've got word that Theo's people are starting to make moves. They're trying to cover their tracks. We need to act fast before they do anything to stop us." Ethan's pulse quickened. "What do we do?" "We've got enough evidence to bring them down," Rachel replied. "But we need to make sure we've locked everything down. I'll be with you soon." We need to get in front of this before they get the chance to flee. Ethan nodded, his resolve hardening. Let's move. That night, as the team assembled and the authorities closed in on Theo's associates, Ethan sat with Sophie and Leo, the weight of the world pressing down on him. The storm was far from over, but he wasn't afraid. He had lost so much, but he had also gained something more valuable, the strength to fight for his family, no matter what. Chapter 7. A Fragile Victory. The next few weeks felt like a race against time. Theo's empire, built on layers of deceit and manipulation, was finally beginning to crumble under the weight of the evidence. The authorities were closing in on his global network of fraud, and Ethan was more determined than ever to ensure that every single person involved would face the consequences of their actions. But even as the investigation gained momentum, the personal toll on Ethan and his family was undeniable. The media coverage surrounding the case had intensified, and with it, the public's insatiable thirst for drama. Theo's arrest had been a spectacle, his carefully curated persona of a successful, charismatic businessman shattered in an instant. Claire's involvement, once hidden in the shadows, was now exposed for the world to see. The media portrayed her as both a victim and a villain, a woman who had been manipulated by Theo, but also a willing participant in the destruction of so many families. Ethan had no illusions about her role. She had chosen her path long ago, and now she was paying the price. Despite the public scrutiny, Ethan remained focused. He spent his days in meetings with legal teams, financial experts, and investigators, piecing together the final details of the case. Every time he thought he had seen the worst, another piece of evidence surfaced, revealing just how far-reaching Theo's criminal activities had been. The web of lies stretched across multiple continents, and Theo's associates were doing everything they could to erase their tracks. But for Ethan, the biggest challenge was his children. Sophie and Leo were struggling, caught between the loyalty they had once felt for their mother and the painful truth that she had been part of the conspiracy that had torn their family apart. The therapy sessions had been necessary, but they had also been heartbreaking. Ethan couldn't begin to understand the full weight of the trauma his children were facing, but he was determined to be there for them every step of the way. One evening, after a long day in court, Ethan returned home to find Sophie sitting in the living room, her eyes red from crying. Leo was by her side, his hand resting on her shoulder in an attempt to comfort her. Ethan's heart tightened as he walked in, knowing that his children were in pain. "Sophie," Ethan said softly, sitting beside her on the couch. "I know this has been really hard on you, on both of you, but I want you to know that I'm here. We're going to get through this together." Sophie looked up at him, her expression a mixture of sadness and confusion. "Dad, why did Mom do it? Why did she help him? How could she hurt us like that?" Ethan's chest ached as he reached out to take her hand. "I don't know, sweetheart. I really don't. But I can't tell you this. She made a choice, and we can't change that. What we can do is make sure that we heal from it. We can't let her decisions define us. We have the power to choose our own path." Leo, ever the optimist, nodded in agreement. "We're still a family. Right, Dad? Even without her?" Ethan smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "Yes, Leo. We're still a family. No matter what happens, nothing will change that. You two are everything to me. We're going to rebuild stronger than before." The words felt like a lifeline, not just for his children, but for himself as well. Every day, Ethan had to remind himself of that strength, because it was so easy to get lost in the whirlwind of betrayal and lies. But his children needed him, and he would not falter. The next morning, Ethan met with Carmen and Rachel to discuss the next steps in the case. They had been gathering evidence at an alarming rate, and it was clear that Theo's network had been far larger than they had anticipated. The list of accomplices was growing, and many of them were well-connected, powerful individuals who would use their influence to protect Theo's operation for years. "We're closing in," Carmen said, her voice calm but firm. "But we need to move quickly. Theo's associates are already trying to cover their tracks. We've intercepted communications that suggest they're planning to flee or go into hiding. We need to act now, before they have a chance to disappear." Ethan nodded, his resolve hardening. "I'll do whatever it takes. We can't let them escape." Rachel spoke up, her tone serious. We're also preparing for the possibility of a counterattack. Theo's lawyers are going to pull out all the stops. We need to be ready for anything." Ethan took a deep breath. He knew that the stakes had never been higher. This wasn't just about taking down a fraudulent business empire. It was about protecting the future of his children, his company, and everything he had worked for. "We're ready," Ethan said. "Let's finish this." The next few days were a blur of high-stakes meetings, legal maneuvers, and strategic planning. The authorities were finally able to secure warrants for several key properties linked to Theo's money laundering operation, and arrests were made in multiple countries. Theo's empire was crumbling, and the criminals who had supported him were being brought to justice. But the fight wasn't over. Theo and his closest allies had managed to evade the full weight of the law for years, and Ethan knew that they wouldn't go down without a fight. As the case approached its final stages, he found himself facing one last hurdle: Clara. The authorities had made it clear that she would be charged for her involvement in the fraud, but there were still lingering questions about her role in the larger conspiracy. Clara had remained silent throughout the investigation, refusing to cooperate with the authorities in exchange for a lighter sentence. But Ethan knew that the truth couldn't be hidden forever. One evening, after another long day of legal proceedings, Ethan received an unexpected phone call. It was Clara's lawyer, requesting a meeting. "Mr. Hayes," the lawyer began, his voice cool and professional. "Clara would like to speak with you. She's willing to cooperate, but she wants to meet in person first. She's asking for a private conversation." Ethan's first instinct was to refuse. After everything that had happened, he had no desire to speak with Clara, especially not alone. But there was a part of him that needed answers, that needed to understand why she had done what she had done. "Fine," Ethan replied, his voice steady. "I'll meet her. But it's on my terms. No more lies." The following evening, Ethan arrived at the small, discreet meeting place. Clara was already there, her once perfect appearance now diminished by the weight of her actions. She had always been composed, always the picture of grace, but now there was a weariness to her that Ethan had never seen before. "Clara," he said, his voice calm but filled with a quiet fury, "I never thought it would come to this. You were my wife, the mother of my children. And yet you chose him. You chose Theo over your own family." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but Ethan didn't let up. "You betrayed us, Clara. You destroyed everything. And for what? Power? Money? A man who doesn't even care about you." Clara looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting nervously. "Ethan, I'm so sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me. But I need you to understand this wasn't easy for me. I was in over my head. I thought we could make everything work. I never meant for it to go this far." Ethan's anger flared, but he pushed it down. He wasn't here for apologies. He was here for answers. "Why did you help him? Why did you destroy our family?" he demanded. Clara took a shaky breath. "I thought I was helping. I thought Theo could give us everything we needed, everything I thought we deserved. I was blinded by what he promised. But it was all lies. All of it. And now I have nothing." Ethan shook his head, the weight of her words sinking in. "You had everything. A family. A life. You didn't need any of that." Clara's voice cracked. "I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. And now I'm paying for it." Ethan stood up, his decision clear. "You've destroyed more than just our marriage, Clara. You've destroyed the lives of so many people. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this for our children. They need to know the truth. And I need to make sure they're safe. That's all that matters now." As Ethan left the meeting, he felt a strange sense of clarity. Clara had tried to justify her actions, but there was no excuse for what she had done. She had chosen Theo over her family, and now she would have to face the consequences. But for Ethan, the most important thing was that his children would have a future free from the shadow of the lies that had haunted them for so long. Chapter 8: The Tipping Point. The weeks following his conversation with Clara were tense and emotionally taxing for Ethan. Despite his best efforts to remain strong for Sophie and Leo, there was a quiet exhaustion that settled into every aspect of his life. The media attention had started to die down, but the echoes of the scandal lingered, creeping into his thoughts and dreams. Every time he thought they were moving forward, some new twist in the case threatened to pull them back into the darkness. The battle against Theo and the network of people who had enabled him was far from over. Even as the authorities closed in on the criminals behind Theo's empire, Ethan could sense that they were only just scratching the surface. There were still pieces of the puzzle left to uncover, and time was running out. He couldn't afford to relax, not yet, not when so much was at stake. One evening, as Ethan sat at the kitchen table reviewing some financial documents, Sophie entered the room. She was quieter these days, her youthful exuberance tempered by the weight of the past months. Ethan noticed the way her shoulders slumped as she walked toward him, and the sadness in her eyes that seemed to weigh her down more than any of them had anticipated. "Dad, can we talk?" Sophie asked, her voice hesitant. Ethan looked up from the papers, setting them aside. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" Sophie sat down across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I've been thinking a lot about Mom and everything that happened. It's hard to understand why she did it, why she kept lying, why she didn't just tell us the truth." Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Do you think she ever really loved us? Or was it all just a game to her?" Ethan's heart ached as he listened to his daughter's words. How could he explain the unfathomable choices Clara had made? How could he make her understand that, despite the betrayal, she was still worthy of love and hope for the future? "I think your mom, she made some very bad decisions, Sophie," Ethan said carefully, choosing his words with great care. "But those choices don't change who you are, and they don't change how much I love you. We can't change the past, but we can choose how we move forward. And you, both of you, are going to be okay. I promise." Sophie looked up at him, tears welling in her eyes. "But how do we know that? How do we know it's really going to be okay?" Ethan leaned forward, his gaze steady and filled with determination. "Because we've been through the hardest part. The truth has come out, and we're still standing. We've survived, and now we get to rebuild. Together." Sophie nodded slowly, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "I'm trying, Dad, but it's hard. It's really hard." "I know it is," Ethan replied softly, his own emotions simmering beneath the surface. "But you're stronger than you think. And you don't have to do it alone. You've got me. And Leo. And we have each other." Sophie's lips quivered as she offered him a small, grateful smile. "Thanks, Dad. I don't know what I'd do without you." Ethan reached across the table, taking her hand gently in his. "You'll never have to find out." As the conversation ended, Ethan sat quietly, reflecting on the bond he shared with his children. The past months had shattered everything they once knew, but it had also forged a new kind of strength between them. It was the kind of strength that couldn't be broken by lies or betrayal. It was the kind of strength that came from the raw, unwavering commitment to each other. The next morning, Ethan received another call from Carmen. The tone of her voice was urgent, and he knew immediately that something had changed. "Ethan, I need you to come to my office. We've got something big. It's about Theo." Ethan's stomach tightened as he made his way to Carmen's office. He had been expecting some sort of final confrontation with Theo, but nothing could prepare him for what he was about to hear. When he arrived, Carmen was waiting for him, her expression hard and determined. "Theo's lawyers have managed to delay the trial, but there's something else going on. We've just uncovered a hidden layer to his operations. He's been blackmailing several high-profile individuals, people who are deeply involved in the political and corporate world. And now we've got proof that some of these people are trying to destroy the case. They're going after you, Ethan." Ethan's heart sank. "What are you saying?" Carmen slid a thick file across the desk. "We've intercepted communication suggesting that they're going to use whatever leverage they have against you to pressure the case into a settlement. They know they're running out of time, and they'll do anything to protect their own interests. This is bigger than just Theo now. These people have power, and they're not going to let this go without a fight." Ethan's hands tightened around the file as the weight of the situation settled over him. It wasn't just Theo's empire anymore. It was a conspiracy that stretched into the highest echelons of society. And now, the most dangerous people in the world were coming after him and his family. I'm not backing down, Ethan said, his voice low and resolute. I've come too far to let them intimidate me. Carmen's eyes softened for a moment. I know you won't, but we need to act quickly. I've arranged a meeting with a trusted ally who can help us take the fight to these people. But we need to be prepared for anything. This is no longer just about Theo. This is about exposing a system of corruption that's been going on for years. Ethan stood up, the decision clear in his mind. I'm ready. Let's do this. As the weeks passed, Ethan's resolve only hardened. He worked closely with Carmen and Rachel, navigating a complex web of legal challenges and threats from powerful individuals who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. But Ethan was determined. He had lost everything once, and he wasn't going to let that happen again. Not without a fight. Every move they made brought them closer to exposing the full scope of Theo's operation, and every day, Ethan found himself feeling a sense of vindication. But there was still one more battle to face, one that would test his strength like never before. Chapter 9. The Final Gambit. The walls of the courtroom felt like they were closing in on Ethan. The stakes had never been higher. Theo and his remaining supporters were pulling out all the stops, using every legal loophole, every connection they had to delay the inevitable. But the truth was on their side, and Ethan wasn't about to back down now. Sophie and Leo had come a long way in their healing, though the scars of the past still lingered. Sophie had become more reserved, Leo more protective. They had witnessed so much in such a short time, and the weight of it all had shaped them in ways that only time would reveal. Ethan watched them closely, doing everything he could to ensure their emotional well-being. Every day, they were slowly picking up the pieces, but the road to recovery was far from smooth. Ethan met with Carmen and Rachel before the trial began. The room was quiet, filled only with the hum of their preparations. The legal team had been working around the clock to ensure that every piece of evidence was in place. Every testimony was airtight. They had to be prepared for whatever Theo's lawyers could throw at them. They knew it was only a matter of time before the tide turned, but that didn't make the wait any easier. You ready for this? Carmen asked, her voice steady but laced with urgency. Ethan took a deep breath. Ready as I'll ever be. But I can't help but feel like something's coming. I can sense it. This isn't over yet. Rachel, ever the realist, nodded in agreement. Theo and his people are desperate. They'll try to do whatever they can to avoid facing justice. We can't let our guard down. Ethan's mind raced. He knew they were fighting not only for justice but for their family's future. This wasn't just about bringing Theo to trial. This was about preventing him from ever being able to manipulate or destroy another family. But the deeper they went into the case, the more they uncovered. It wasn't just Theo's fraud and manipulation. They were up against a network that reached into the highest levels of government and business. Every day, the stakes grew higher. The trial began, and with it, the true extent of Theo's manipulation came to light. Witness after witness took the stand, testifying to his underhanded dealings, his fraud, and his unscrupulous tactics. The evidence was overwhelming, but Theo's legal team was relentless, doing everything they could to discredit the witnesses and sow doubt in the mind of the jurors. Ethan sat in the courtroom, his eyes never leaving the defendant's chair. Theo sat there calm, almost serene, as though he hadn't already been defeated. His demeanor was chilling. He hadn't lost his charm, and he hadn't lost his ability to manipulate. But Ethan could see through it now. He had seen what Theo was capable of, and no amount of charisma could change that. Clara's testimony was one of the most difficult moments of the trial. When she took the stand, the air in the courtroom seemed to freeze. She was composed, but her eyes betrayed the pain she was in. She had tried to remain stoic, but it was clear that the truth had taken its toll on her. Clara's involvement in the fraud had been exposed for the world to see, and the weight of her betrayal was visible in every word she spoke. "Why did you do it?" the prosecutor asked, her voice sharp as she addressed Clara. Clara's voice faltered. I was trying to protect my family," she whispered. "Theo promised me a future, one that we could have together. I was selfish. I thought I was doing what was best for us." Ethan's heart ached as he listened to Clara's words. She had chosen Theo over her family. She had placed her trust in a man who had used her, manipulated her, and ultimately destroyed everything she held dear. Yet, even in the face of all the evidence, she still couldn't admit the full scope of her role. The defense tried to argue that Clara was a victim in all of this, that she had been coerced and manipulated by Theo. But the jury wasn't buying it. Clara's actions spoke for themselves. She had been complicit. She had knowingly helped Theo ruin lives, including the lives of her own children. As the trial wore on, the tension in the courtroom reached a fever pitch. Theo's legal team was grasping at straws, trying to create confusion and shift the focus away from the crimes he had committed. But it was becoming increasingly clear that they were fighting a losing battle. The evidence was insurmountable. There was no escape for Theo now. Then, just when it seemed like they were on the verge of victory, a shocking twist occurred. Ethan was in his office when he received an urgent call from Carmen. "We've got a problem," she said, her voice tense. "Theo's lawyers have found a loophole. They're claiming that the evidence we've gathered is inadmissible because of a technicality in how the investigation was handled. They're trying to get the entire case thrown out." Ethan's blood ran cold. He had known they would fight dirty, but this was a move he hadn't anticipated. They were trying to discredit everything they had worked for, to erase the truth and leave Ethan with nothing. "They can't do this," Ethan said, his voice tight with frustration. "We worked too hard for this. I won't let them get away with it." Carmen's voice was filled with resolve. "We're not backing down. We'll fight this, but we need to act fast. The judge will make a ruling soon, and if we don't push back, we could lose everything." Ethan's mind raced as he thought about his next move. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't let Theo and his team manipulate the system any longer. He had come too far to watch it all slip through his fingers. With a renewed sense of urgency, Ethan gathered his team and prepared for one final showdown. They would not let Theo's last-ditch attempt to escape justice succeed. This was their moment to make sure the truth prevailed, no matter the cost. As the day of the ruling arrived, Ethan sat in the courtroom, his heart pounding in his chest. He had spent years building a life, only to have it destroyed in the blink of an eye. But he wasn't going to let that happen again. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. The judge entered the courtroom, and the room fell silent. Every eye was on him as he prepared to deliver his verdict. Ethan held his breath, his fingers gripping the edge of the bench. This was it, the moment that would define their future. "The evidence in this case is overwhelming," the judge began. "There is no doubt that Theo Bennett and his associates have engaged in a systematic campaign of fraud, manipulation, and destruction. The court finds that the charges against the defendant are valid, and the case will proceed." Ethan exhaled in relief, his heart finally beginning to slow. This was the victory he had fought for, the victory his family deserved. Theo would be held accountable for the pain he had caused, and justice would finally be served. Chapter 10. Rebuilding what was lost. The days that followed the trial were filled with a quiet sense of victory, though the weight of the months before still lingered. Theo Bennett's conviction had come as a relief, but had also marked the beginning of a new chapter for Ethan, Sophie, and Leo. The truth had been revealed, the lies had been exposed, but healing, true healing, was still a long road ahead. For Sophie and Leo, the process of rebuilding their lives was much more complicated than it had seemed at first. Though they had always been strong, the emotional scars left by the betrayal of their mother and the deception that had haunted their family for years ran deeper than they had realized. The therapy sessions continued, each one a step closer to understanding the full extent of the damage and the strength it would take to overcome it. Ethan spent hours with them, reassuring them that they weren't alone. "We've got each other," he would say. "That's the most important thing. Everything else is just noise." At night, they would gather in the living room, sometimes talking about the case, sometimes not. They learned to fill the silence with shared moments, moments of joy, humor, and love that had been missing for far too long. The day of Theo's sentencing was a somber occasion, though it brought with it a sense of finality. The courtroom was filled with the victims of Theo's fraud, families whose lives had been torn apart by his actions. There were more faces in the crowd than Ethan had expected. It was a reminder of how far-reaching Theo's manipulation had been, and how much work there was still to do to help the other families heal. As the judge handed down the sentence, 20 years for Theo? Ethan sat quietly, his thoughts on the victims who had come forward, on his own family, and on the future that still lay before them. But the victory wasn't just in the courtroom. It was in the quiet moments of rebuilding his life, step by step. The moments when Sophie laughed, when Leo smiled, and when Ethan realized that they were becoming a family again, one not bound by blood, but by the deep, unshakable bonds of love and trust. The Hayes Construction Company, once again at the forefront of Portland's business community, continued to thrive. Ethan had made sure that no one in his company would ever experience the betrayal he had gone through. His commitment to safety, integrity, and fairness became the foundation of a new era for Hayes Construction. But as successful as the business was, Ethan knew that it was his family that mattered most. The future he was building wasn't just about projects or profits. It was about creating a safe, loving space for Sophie and Leo to grow, heal, and flourish. One day, while they were having dinner at the table, Sophie spoke up. "Dad, I've been thinking about the future a lot lately. And I think I want to go to college. Actually, I know I do. I want to study architecture. I know it's a big step, but it feels right." Ethan's heart swelled with pride as he looked at his daughter. Sophie had always been driven, always looking to the future, but to hear her speak with such confidence about what she wanted to do filled him with hope. "That's a big decision, Sophie, but I know you're capable of anything you set your mind to. Whatever you decide, I'll be here to support you." Sophie smiled, the light returning to her eyes. "Thanks, Dad. I think this is the start of something new for me. Something better." Leo, who had been quietly listening, chimed in. "You know, Sophie, I've been thinking about studying psychology. I want to help people like we've been helped. I want to help other kids who've been through tough stuff." Ethan looked at his son, his heart swelling again. "That's an incredible idea, Leo. You both have so much potential. You've already been through more than most people ever will, and you're already stronger because of it." It was in these moments, when his children spoke with hope about the future, that Ethan knew they were finally healing. The past would always be there, a reminder of the pain they had all endured, but it no longer had the power to define them. The future was theirs to shape, and they were doing it together. As the weeks went by, Ethan focused on his family, his company, and the future. The devastation caused by Theo and Clara's actions would never be completely erased, but Ethan's resolve to rebuild, to protect his children, to provide them with a safe, loving home was stronger than ever. Clara's sentencing followed soon after Theo's, though it was met with less fanfare. Her role in the scheme was undeniable, and though she had cooperated with authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence, the damage she had caused was irrevocable. As she was taken into custody, Ethan couldn't help but feel a deep sense of finality. She had made her choices, and now she had to face the consequences. The day of her departure was marked by no fanfare. It was an end of a chapter, but also the beginning of a new one. One where Ethan could finally breathe without the constant fear of betrayal lurking in the background. But the work wasn't done. There were still other families to help, other victims who had been manipulated in the same way Ethan and his family had been. The Hayes Family Support Center had become a beacon of hope for those families, offering legal assistance, therapy, and resources to rebuild their lives. It wasn't just about helping victims of fertility fraud, it was about offering them a future, one free of fear and manipulation. Ethan stood in the center's lobby one evening, watching the families come and go. He saw their pain, their fear, and their hope. And in their eyes, he saw the same strength that had carried his own family through the darkest days of their lives. It wasn't just about bringing criminals to justice. It was about giving people a chance to rebuild, to recover, and to choose a future that was theirs to create. As he watched Sophie and Leo talking to some of the kids in the support group, Ethan felt a profound sense of pride. They were doing more than surviving. They were thriving. They had found their way through the darkness, and now they were lighting the way for others. And in that moment, Ethan knew that no matter how much they had lost, they had gained something even more valuable, the power to rebuild, to heal, and to choose their own path together. Chapter 11. The Legacy of Love. It had been a year since Theo and Clara's convictions had been handed down. A year since Ethan and his children had started rebuilding the life they had lost. Time had healed some wounds, but not all. Some scars would always remain, reminders of the betrayal and the darkness that had clouded their past. Yet, despite everything, they were stronger. They had emerged from the ashes of their shattered world, unbroken and united in a way they never had been before. Ethan sat in the quiet of his home office, the afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the room. He looked at the photographs on the wall, pictures of his children, moments of happiness that had been stolen from them for far too long. Sophie, now settled into her first year of college, had chosen architecture, just as she had dreamed. Leo, too, had found his path, studying psychology with a passion that surprised even him. They were both growing, healing, becoming the people they were meant to be. And he couldn't have been prouder. The phone rang, snapping Ethan out of his thoughts. It was Carmen. "Ethan, we've made a breakthrough," she said, her voice filled with urgency. "We've tracked down the last of the shell companies involved in Theo's operation. The final pieces are falling into place." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "What does this mean?" "It means we've got them," Carmen replied, her voice determined. "This is the last step in taking down the entire network. Theo's empire won't be able to survive this. We've got solid evidence on every last person involved." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning. It had been a long, exhausting journey to get to this point, but the victory was finally within reach. The pieces of Theo's criminal empire were scattered, and the network that had helped him manipulate and ruin countless lives would soon be dismantled for good. "Let's make sure they're never able to hurt anyone again," Ethan said, his voice firm. As the investigation neared its conclusion, Ethan couldn't help but reflect on everything that had led him here. He had lost so much. His marriage, his trust in the people he thought he knew, his sense of safety in the world. But in the process of rebuilding, he had gained something more precious than anything else, a deep, unshakable bond with his children. He was no longer just a man running a business, a man trying to survive the fallout of a catastrophic betrayal. He was a father, a protector, who had weathered the storm and come out the other side stronger and more determined than ever. That evening, Ethan walked downstairs to find Sophie and Leo sitting at the kitchen table, papers scattered around them as they worked on their studies. The house felt different now, quiet, but not in the way it once had been. There was peace here now, the kind that had been impossible to imagine when everything had first fallen apart. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, watching his children for a moment, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. They had been through so much together, and yet they had found a way to move forward. Together. "How's the work going?" he asked, his voice warm with fatherly pride. Sophie looked up, smiling. "I'm getting the hang of it. I've been sketching out ideas for a new project. It's tough, but I'm excited about it." Leo, who had been absorbed in his notes, looked up as well. "I'm still working through some of the readings, but I think I'm going to be okay." Ethan felt a knot in his chest loosen as he looked at them both. "You're more than okay. You're both amazing." Sophie set down her pencil and gave her dad a long look, her expression thoughtful. "Dad, I know it's been a tough year. For all of us. But I think we're finally starting to heal. We're finally starting to live again." Leo nodded, his voice steady and resolute. "Yeah, we've been through a lot, but we're stronger now. We've got each other. And that's what matters." Ethan's eyes blurred with emotion, but he smiled. "That's exactly right. We've been through hell, but we're still here. We're still standing. And we're going to keep moving forward, together." As he spoke, Ethan realized that their journey of rebuilding was far from over. There would always be challenges, always be moments of doubt. But with Sophie and Leo by his side, there was no mountain too high, no obstacle too great. They had already faced the worst and survived. And now, they were looking to the future with hope, strength, and an unbreakable bond. Later that night, after Sophie and Leo had gone to bed, Ethan stood at the window, looking out over the city. The world had changed in ways he could never have predicted. He had lost so much, but he had also gained more than he ever thought possible. He had his children, his family, and the opportunity to rebuild something better, something unbreakable. He had built his empire on the foundations of trust, integrity, and hard work. And now he was building something even more important, something that would last long after the echoes of the past faded away. True family isn't defined by blood or DNA. It's defined by the choices we make. The choice to love, to protect, and to stand together through the toughest storms. And as Ethan looked out over the city, watching the first stars of the evening begin to appear in the sky, he knew that the best was yet to come.